Welcome to Renwick Psychology Academy. So in this lesson we'll explore key concepts from A-level psychology, breaking down theories, research studies and evaluations in a clear and exam-focused way. The aim is to help you understand the psychology, apply it confidently and succeed in your exams. So we'll start with memory, looking at coding, capacity and duration. So psychologists study memory in terms of coding, capacity and duration, particularly within short-term memory and long-term memory. So coding refers to the form in which the information is stored, and Baddeley conducted two key studies in 1966 to investigate this. In his first study, participants were given lists of acoustically similar words, acoustically dissimilar words, semantically similar words and semantically dissimilar words. And when recalling words immediately, participants struggled most with acoustically similar words, suggesting that short-term memory mainly uses acoustic coding. However, when recall was delayed, participants had more difficulty with semantically similar words, indicating that long-term memory relies primarily on semantic coding. Capacity refers to the amount of information that can be held in memory, and Jacobs investigated the capacity of short-term memory using the digit span technique, and he found that the average digit span was around 9.3 for numbers and 7.3 for letters, suggesting that short-term memory has a limited capacity. This finding was supported by Miller, who proposed that the capacity of short-term memory is around 7 items plus or minus 2, and Miller also suggested that chunking can increase capacity by grouping information into meaningful units. Duration refers to how long the information can be stored in memory, and Peterson investigated the duration of short-term memory by asking participants to recall trigrams after counting backwards to prevent rehearsal. And they found that recall dropped rapidly after about 18 to 30 seconds, suggesting that short-term memory has a very limited duration without rehearsal. In contrast, Barrick investigated the duration of long-term memory using a naturalistic study of participants' memory for classmates, names and faces. And he found that participants were able to recall and recognize information accurately even after around 48 years, suggesting that long-term memory can last a lifetime. So overall, research suggests that short-term memory is limited in coding, capacity and duration, whereas long-term memory is primarily semantic and has a very large capacity and can store information for many years or even up to a lifetime. So evaluation of coding, capacity and duration. So research into coding, capacity and duration provides strong support for the idea that memory is made up of separate stores, such as short-term memory and long-term memory. The strength of research into coding is that it sort of demonstrates clear differences between memory stores. Baddeley's studies showed that short-term memory relies mainly on acoustic coding, whereas long-term memory relies more on semantic coding. And this supports the multi-store model's claim that short-term and long-term are distinct systems. However, a limitation of the research is that it often uses artificial stimuli, such as word lists, and remembering random words does not reflect how memory operates in everyday life, which reduces ecological validity. Research into capacity also has strengths. Jacobs' digit span study can easily be replicated and has produced consistent results. However, it lacks control over extraneous variables, such as participants' rehearsal strategies or familiarity with numbers, which have affected the results. Later research by Bopp and Verhagen found that digit span capacity increases with age, suggesting that capacity may not be fixed and can be influenced by experience and cognitive development. In addition, Miller estimates 7 plus or minus 2 chunks has been criticised. Nelson Cowan argued that capacity is much smaller at around 4 plus or minus 1 chunks, suggesting that Miller overestimated short-term memory capacity by including rehearsal effects. Research into duration, such as Peterson's study of short-term memory, supports the idea that short-term memory has a limited duration. However, it's unclear whether forgetting occurs due to decay or interference, as participants were required to count backwards, which may displace the memory trace. A strength of long-term memory research is its high external validity, and Barrick's study of memory for classmates used real-life meaningful information and demonstrates that long-term memory can last for decades. And further support comes from Shepherd's research, which showed that participants could accurately recognize images even after long delays, suggesting that long-term memory has a very large capacity and duration. Overall, while research into coding capacity and duration strongly supports the existence of separate memory stores, methodological issues and alternative explanations limit how confidently conclusions can be drawn. So the multi-store model of memory, 1968. The multi-store model of memory was proposed by Atkinson and Schifrin in 1968, and it suggests that memory is made up of three separate stores: the sensory register, the short-term memory store, and the long-term memory store. So information first enters the sensory register through our senses. Each sense has its own sensory store, such as iconic memory for vision or echoic memory for sound. The sensory register has a very large capacity but a very short duration, lasting less than half a second for visual information and up to 2 seconds for auditory information. If attention is not paid, the information is lost through decay. If attention is paid, information moves into the short-term memory store, and short-term memory has a limited capacity of around 7 items plus or minus 2, and a duration of around 18 to 30 seconds unless it's rehearsed. Coding in short-term memory is mainly acoustic, and without rehearsal, information is lost from short-term memory through decay or displacement. Maintenance rehearsal is the key process that keeps information in short-term memory, and if rehearsal continues for long enough, information is transferred into long-term memory. Long-term memory has a very large potential, unlimited capacity, and a long duration that can last up to a lifetime. Coding in long-term memory is mainly semantic, meaning information is stored by its meaning. Forgetting from long-term memory is thought to occur due to interference rather than decay, and the model assumes that information must pass through short-term memory in order to reach long-term memory, and that rehearsal is essential for long-term storage. So some support for the multi-store model comes from the case study of HM. After surgery to remove parts of his hippocampus, HM was unable to form new long-term memories. However, his short-term memory remained intact, suggesting that short-term and long-term memory are separate stores. So overall, the multi-store model provides a simple and influential explanation of how memory works, highlighting the structure of memory and the processes involved in remembering and forgetting. So, evaluation of the multi-store model of memory. So one strength of the multi-store model is the evidence for separate memory stores. So neuroimaging research supports the idea that different types of memory are processed in different brain areas. So for example, Larry Squire in 2009 found that the hippocampus is associated with long-term memory, while the prefrontal cortex is more involved in short-term memory. And this supports the idea that short-term and long-term are separate stores. Further support comes from brain scans. The research by Charan, Ranganath and Robert Bloomfield in 2005, they found that different patterns of brain activity were shown when participants were using short-term memory compared to long-term memory, again supporting the idea of distinct memory systems. However, a key limitation of the multi-store model is that it's oversimplistic. Research suggests that there is more than one type of short-term memory store. So Shalish and Warrington's 1970 case study of a patient called KF showed that KF had severely impaired verbal short-term memory, but relatively normal visual short-term memory. This suggests that short-term is not a single unitary store as proposed by the model. Another limitation concerns the role of rehearsal. The multi-store model assumes that maintenance rehearsal is the main way information is transferred from short-term to long-term. However, Craig and Watkins in 1973 showed that the amount of rehearsal is not as important as the type of rehearsal. They found that elaborative rehearsal, which involves processing meaning, leads to better long-term retention and simple repetition. This challenges the model's emphasis on maintenance rehearsal, And finally, the multi-store model may be better described as a framework rather than a precise model. John Wixted in 2024 argued that while the model is useful for organising research and understanding basic memory processes, it lacks detail about how memory actually works in practice. This limits its explanatory power. So overall, while the multi-store model has been highly influential and is supported by evidence for separate memory stores, it's criticised for being too simplistic and for underestimating the complexity of the memory processes. So now we'll look at the working memory model. So this is a model by Bradley and Hitch in 1974, and it's an alternative to the multi-store model. So rather than viewing short-term memory as a single unitary store, the model suggests that working memory is an active system made up of several components, each with a specific function. At the centre of the model is the central executive. This is an attentional control system that coordinates information from other components. There's a very limited capacity and is responsible for directing attention, switching tasks, and allocating resources. Importantly, it does not store information itself. One slave system is the phonological loop, which deals with verbal and auditory information, and it consists of two parts: the phonological store, which temporarily holds spoken words, and the articulatory rehearsal process, which allows information to be refreshed through repetition. This explains why verbal information is easily lost without rehearsal. Another component is the visuospatial sketchpad. This processes visual and spatial information such as shapes, colours and movement. It's particularly important for tasks like navigation or visual imagery and has a limited capacity. Bradley later added the episodic buffer to the model in around the year 2000. This component integrates information from the phonological loop, the visuospatial sketchpad, and long-term memory. It also allows information to be combined into a single coherent episode, supporting complex cognitive tasks such as reasoning and comprehension. So overall, the working memory model provides a more detailed and flexible explanation for short-term memory, showing that different types of information are processed in separate but interacting systems. So evaluation of the working memory model. One strength of the working memory model comes from the case study evidence, particularly the case of KF, studied by Chalice and Warrington. So KF suffered brain damage following a motorbike accident and showed severe impairment in verbal short-term memory, but relatively intact visual and spatial memory. This supports the idea that the phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad are separate components, rather than a single unitary short-term memory store, as suggested by the multi-store model. However, a limitation of using case studies like KF is that brain damage is rarely neat or isolated. KF's injuries may have affected other cognitive processes, meaning the findings may not be generalizable to the wider population. There's also strong support from neuroimaging research. So Edward Smith and John Jonides used PET scans, which is positron emission tomography, and found that different areas of the brain were activated during different working memory tasks. So verbal tasks were associated with activity in the left hemisphere, particularly Broca's area, while visual and spatial tasks activated areas in the right hemisphere. This provides biological evidence for the existence of separate working memory components and supports the validity of the model. Despite this, a key weakness of the model concerns the central executive. Bradley himself acknowledged in 2003 that the central executive is the most important component of working memory, but also the least understood. It appears to be vague and overly simplistic as a concept that may actually consist of several different processes, such as attention control and task coordination. This lack of detail reduces explanatory power of the model. Another strength of the working memory model is its support from dual task paradigms. Research has shown that people can perform two tasks simultaneously more easily when they use different components of the working memory model, such as a visual task and a verbal task. However, performance declines when the two tasks compete for the same component, for example, two verbal tasks. This supports the idea of multiple limited capacity systems within the working memory model. So overall, the working memory model is well supported by experimental and neuroimaging evidence. and provides a more detailed and realistic account of short-term memory than earlier models. However, its limited explanation of the central executive means it is still incomplete. Explanations for forgetting, starting with interference. So one explanation for forgetting is interference theory. So interference occurs when two sets of information compete with each other, causing one memory to disrupt the recall of another. There are two main types of interference: proactive interference and retroactive interference. Proactive interference occurs when older memories interfere with the recall of new information. For example, if someone has learned an old phone number, this may make it harder to remember a new phone number. Retroactive interference is the opposite. This happens when new information interferes with the recall of older memories. For instance, learning a new password may cause someone to forget their old one. Research has shown that interference is more likely when the material is similar. And McGock and MacDonald in 1931 demonstrated this by asking participants to learn a list of words followed by a second list. When the second list was similar in meaning to the first, recall of the original list was much worse than when the second list was dissimilar. So this suggests that forgetting is not simply due to memories fading over time, but instead occurs because similar pieces of information compete and become confused during retrieval. The overall interference theory explains forgetting as a result of competition between memories, particularly when they are similar and stored close together in time. Evaluation of interference theory. A strength of interference theory is that it is supported by research evidence from real-world settings. And Badley and Hitch's study of rugby players found that the recall of the team's names depended on the number of intervening matches played rather than the time since learning. This supports interference theory because forgetting increased as more similar information was learned, showing that interference, not decay, caused forgetting. This gives the theory higher ecological validity than many lab studies. However, much of the research supporting interference theory comes from lab experiments using artificial materials such as word lists. These tasks often lack ecological validity because memorizing lists of unrelated words does not reflect how memory is used in everyday life. As a result, interference theory may overestimate the role of interference in real-world forgetting. Another limitation is that interference effects can be reduced when appropriate cues are provided. Tolving and Sotska found that participants could recall words from earlier lists when category cues were given, even after learning many similar lists. This suggests that the information was not lost, but temporarily inaccessible, which challenges the idea that interference causes permanent forgetting. Individual differences also limit interference theory as a general explanation. Edward Vogel found that individuals with high working memory capacity are less affected by interference than those with low capacity. This suggests that forgetting is influenced by cognitive differences between individuals, not just the presence of competing information. So overall, interference theory is a useful explanation for forgetting, particularly when information is similar, but it cannot explain all cases of forgetting, and it is influenced by cues, individual differences, and the artificial nature of much of the supporting research. Explanation for forgetting retrieval failure. Another explanation for forgetting is called retrieval failure, and retrieval failure occurs when information is stored in long-term memory, but it can't be accessed because appropriate retrieval cues are missing. This explanation is based on the encoding specificity principle proposed by Tolving, and Tolving argued that memory retrieval is most effective when the cues present at recall match those that were present at encoding. So in other words, if the context or internal state at the time of learning is different at recall, forgetting is more likely to occur. This helps to explain why people often remember information better in the same environment in which it was learned. This is known as context-dependent forgetting. A classic study demonstrating this by Godden and Badley in 1975 research with deep-sea divers. So the divers learned word lists either on land or underwater and were later asked to recall them in the same or different context. The findings showed that the recall was best when learning and recall took place in the same environment, and worse when the context differed. This supports the idea that environmental cues aid retrieval. Retrieval failure can also occur due to state-dependent forgetting. This refers to when an individual is in an internal state, such as in a mood or level of intoxication. Intoxication differs between the encoding and recall. And for example, Carter and Cassidy found that participants who learned information while under the influence of drugs recalled it better when in the same state again. Recall was poorer when participants were sober, showing that the internal cues also act as retrieval cues. So overall, retrieval failure suggests that forgetting is not due to information being lost, but is due to a failure to access it because the correct cues are not available. So evaluation of retrieval failure. So there's strong research support for retrieval failure as an explanation for forgetting. Godden and Badley's study with the deep sea divers showed that recall was significantly better when learning and recall took place in the same context, either both on land or both underwater. This supports the encoding specificity principle, which states that recall is most effective when cues present at encoding are also present at retrieval. Similarly, Carter and Cassidy found that recall was better when participants were in the same physiological state, either on antihistamines or not, at learning and recall, providing evidence for state-dependent forgetting. However, a key limitation is that context effects may be weak in everyday life. Badley argued that the most real-world contexts are not sufficiently distinct to produce large effects on memory. For example, being in a different classroom is unlikely to disrupt recall as much as being underwater versus on land, limiting the application of retrieval failure to everyday forgetting. There are also issues with the interpretation of context and state effects. Jack Muir pointed out that in the underwater studies, being 7 meters below the surface involves more than just a change in context due to things like breathing issues, pressure, and body temperature. These physiological changes may have impaired recall rather than retrieval failure alone explaining the findings. Further evidence questions whether retrieval failure applies to all types of memory tests. Godden and Badley later replicated their study using recognition instead of recall and found no significant context effects. This suggests that context cues may be more important for recall than recognition, limiting the scope of the explanation. Finally, there are problems with the encoding specificity principle itself. Tulving argued that while retrieval cues are important, not all forgetting can be explained by the absence of cues, as memories may still fail to be retrieved even when appropriate cues are available. And this suggests retrieval failure is a useful but incomplete explanation of forgetting. Factors affecting the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. So one important factor affecting the accuracy of eyewitness testimony is the use of leading questions. Leading questions are questions that are phrased in a way that suggest a particular answer. So Lotters and Palmer carried out a classic study in 1974 to investigate this effect. In the first experiment, participants watched video clips of car accidents and were asked questions about what they'd seen. One critical question asked how fast the cars were going when they hit, collided, bumped, or contacted or smashed into the other. The findings showed that participants who heard the word smashed gave significantly higher speed estimations than those who heard a less intense verb such as hit or contacted. This suggests that the wording of a question can influence memory recall. In the second experiment, conducted 1 week later, participants were asked whether they had seen broken glass at the accident. In reality, there was no broken glass. Those who previously heard the word smashed were far more likely to report seeing broken glass compared to the hit and control groups. This demonstrates that leading questions can distort eyewitnesses' memory by introducing misleading information, affecting both recall and later reconstruction of events. Another key factor affecting eyewitness testimony is post-event discussion. also known as PED. This occurs when witnesses discuss an event with each other after it has taken place. Gabbert and colleagues conducted a study in 2003 to investigate the effects of post-event discussion, and participants watched the same crime but from different views, meaning each person saw slightly different details. They were then allowed to discuss what they'd seen with one another before completing an individual recall test, and the findings showed that participants often reported details they had not actually seen but had picked up during the discussion. This suggests that post-event discussion can contaminate eyewitness memory. There are several explanations for post-event discussion and why it affects eyewitness accuracy. So one explanation is memory conformity, where individuals change their memory to match others' accounts. Another explanation is social approval, where witnesses agree with others to avoid conflict or to appear correct. Finally, discussion can lead to distorted memories, where new information becomes integrated into the original memory trace. Overall, research shows that eyewitness testimony is not a reliable record of events. It is vulnerable to distortion through both leading questions and post-event discussion. Evaluation of factors affecting the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. So one strength of research into eyewitness testimony is its important real-world application for the criminal justice system. So, for example, Loftus provided expert testimony in a number of court cases, highlighting how leading questions can distort eyewitness memory. This research has helped raise awareness among police and legal professionals about the unreliability of eyewitness evidence and has influenced how witnesses are questioned. However, there is evidence that the effects of leading questions may be overstated. Sutherland and Hain, 2001, found that while misleading questions can affect peripheral details, central details of an event are often recalled accurately. This suggests that eyewitness memory may be more reliable than earlier research implied, particularly for important aspects of a crime. A further limitation of research into leading questions is use of lab experiments. Studies such as Loftus and Palmer often involve artificial tasks, such as watching short video clips, which lack emotional involvement. Zaragoza and McCloskey, 1989, argued that participants may show demand characteristics, guessing the aim of the study and adjusting their responses accordingly. There is strong research support for the effect of post-event discussion on eyewitness accuracy. Skagerberg and Wright, 2009, studied 790 participants who watched a crime video and found that discussion with others significantly distorted recall. This supports the idea that memory conformity and social approval influence eyewitness testimony. However, post-event discussion is increasingly difficult to control in modern society. The rise of social media means witnesses can be exposed to many alternative accounts of an event, reducing the validity of lab findings. Elson et al. 2020 argued that online discussion makes it almost impossible to prevent contamination of eyewitness memories. And overall, while research clearly demonstrates that factors such as leading questions and post-event discussion can reduce the accuracy of eyewitness testimony, issues of ecological validity and the modern influences such as social media limit how confidently these findings can be applied to the real-world situations. Factors affecting the accuracy of eyewitness testimony: anxiety. So anxiety can have a significant impact on the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. When a person experiences anxiety, the body activates the fight or flight response. This increases physiological arousal like heart rate, adrenaline, which can affect attention and memory. One explanation for reduced accuracy is the weapon focus effect. This occurs when the presence of a weapon draws attention away from the details of the scene, such as the offender's face. Johnson and Scott conducted a lab study to investigate this effect, and participants waited in a room and then overheard an argument. In the low anxiety condition, a man emerged holding a pen with grease on his hands, and in the high anxiety condition, the man emerged holding a blood-stained knife. Participants were later asked to identify the man from the photos. Accuracy was much lower in the knife condition, with only around 1/3 correctly identifying the individual. compared to almost half in the pen condition. This suggests that high anxiety reduces the accuracy of eyewitness recall. However, anxiety does not always have a negative effect on eyewitness testimony. Julian Kutzall studied real-life eyewitnesses to a shooting in Vancouver, and they interviewed witnesses several months after the event and compared their accounts with official police records. The witnesses who experienced the highest level of anxiety actually gave the most accurate accounts. They also showed little change in their memories over time, suggesting that anxiety can enhance recall in real-world situations. So these contradictory findings can be explained by the Yerkes-Dodson law, which proposes that an inverted U-shaped relationship between arousal and performance. So according to this theory, memory accuracy is the best at moderate levels of anxiety. Too little anxiety leads to poor attention, while too much anxiety overwhelms cognitive processing and reduces recall. Deffenbacher reviewed 21 studies and found evidence supporting this inverted U relationship, helping to explain why anxiety can sometimes improve and sometimes impair eyewitness memory. So overall, anxiety affects eyewitness testimony in complex ways, but its impact depends on factors such as intensity, context, and whether the situation is real or artificial. Evaluation of the effects of anxiety on eyewitness testimony. So one issue with research into anxiety and eyewitness testimony is that it may not be anxiety itself that reduces accuracy, but the unusual nature of the stimuli. Pickel in 1998 argued that weapon focus may be explained by unusualness rather than anxiety. So in her study, participants saw a man holding either scissors, a wallet, or a handgun. Memory accuracy was lowest for the unusual objects, regardless of threat. This suggests attention is drawn to unexpected items, not anxiety specifically. Another problem is how anxiety is measured. Carey, Marr and colleagues 2021 pointed out that anxiety is often measured subjectively using self-reports, which may lack validity. Alternatively, objective measures such as heart rate or cortisol levels are used, but these do not always reflect psychological anxiety. This makes conclusions about anxiety and memory less certain. There's research support for the idea that anxiety can enhance recall. Christiansen and Hubinetti, 1993, studied 58 real witnesses to bank robberies in Sweden, and they found that witnesses who experienced high levels of anxiety were more accurate when recalling central details of the event, even several months later. This supports the idea that anxiety can improve memory of important information. However, these witnesses were interviewed long after the event and may have discussed the incident with others, meaning post-event discussion could have influenced their memories. This reduces internal validity. And finally, the Yerkes-Dodson law may oversimplify the relationship between anxiety and memory. Anxiety has cognitive, emotional, behavioural and physiological components, and these may affect recall differently. This means the inverted U explanation may not fully capture the complexity of how anxiety influences eyewitness testimony. So we appreciate your participation and we sincerely appreciate your time and interest in engaging with our educational content. Feel free to join Renwick Psychology Academy to deepen your understanding and enhance your psychology studies. So stay connected by subscribing to our YouTube channel for regular updates and valuable psychology resources.